Hello and welcome this evening to this Microsoft EU presidency debate with Euractiv. Today we're going to be talking about the AI Act and specifically how it needs to align with other international policies on artificial intelligence. I'm Jennifer Baker. I'm a policy journalist based here in Brussels and I'll be your moderator this evening. We will have opportunities for those in the room here in Microsoft to ask questions using a microphone and also for those of you joining online. But let's set the scene first a little bit. We all know that the EU AI Act was proposed by the European Commission back in 2021. It seems a lot longer ago now, as we've seen so many iterations and backs and forths on how it's going to be managed. As we all know, essentially, it's a risk-based approach. We'll talk a bit more about that on our panel and how that works alongside the other international movements that are also happening, because we have seen as well the G7 leaders agreed to establish the Hiroshima AI process in May. The Council of Europe is, of course, working on its own guidelines as well. And what we need to see globally avoided is a patchwork effect where different AI rules compete with each other. Earlier this year, in July, Spain took over the rolling EU presidency and put it as a top priority to really try and get the AI Act through the trialogues, through those long negotiations by the end of this year, which is a tall order. We're right at the end of the process, so there's still a lot to discuss, even though we haven't seen a final text, but we certainly know what's likely to be in and out of it. So I'm going to hand over to say a warm welcome to our host here this evening, to Nana Louise Linde, Vice President of European Government Affairs at Microsoft.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. What a whirlwind it's been lately. In my 18 years at Microsoft, I've never seen so many changes in such a short time. And the catalyst is, of course, AI. And AI every day unveils new efficiency at our work and our personal lives. I see new examples every day on how this new technology changes our daily lives or solves societal problems. Last Friday, I spoke to my sister. She's a doctor in a big hospital in Denmark. And she told me that at the University of Copenhagen, they are now launching a groundbreaking AI model called U-Sleep. And it's transforming sleep disorder treatment. So it's a PhD student who invented it. And it segments sleep recordings into seconds, a task that once took many hours to do. And while it's not diagnosing anything, it does provide doctors with rapid, data-rich insights so that they can better find the right cure for the patient. And I think that's just one example of how AI will help in the health sector and in many other sectors. And of course, with the great potential for this technology comes great questions. How do we harness AI for good? How do we address the challenges it brings? And how do we control such a powerful tool? We actually already 5 years ago at Microsoft started to look into these questions. We set up an Office of Responsible AI, and in 2018, they came up with some core principles that we decided to let guide us when we build the product, when we test the product, and so on. And it's about transparency, responsibility, accountability, fairness, inclusiveness. And that guides us actually in every aspect of our work. But it's, of course, not only a private sector task. The EU is leading with its AI Act and hope that it will be a blueprint for using tech for social good. And the Spanish presidency, as you said, is pivotal. The focus on finalizing the AI Act isn't just about speed. It's about striking the right balance for AI across Europe. And it's about making sure that Europe and European companies, European governments, can leverage all the opportunities that AI brings, and at the same time set the right guardrails. So, why is today's discussion so important? As we anticipate the AI Act's final touches, it's essential to align Europe's stance with the global AI initiatives, like the Hiroshima process. It's about setting a precedence, not only just for now, but for the future of AI governance. And a few weeks ago, we had the pleasure here to host Anu Bradford. And I think I saw some of you there to talk about her new book, Digital Empires. And it's really a must-read. She really brilliantly delineates the digital empires, China, the US, Europe, each with a distinct tech regulation approach. And Europe stands out with its right-based approach. And I think that is a good approach for regulation. I think part of Microsoft's success is that we tuned in on our technology's impact, and this was key to our success. But I commend the Spanish presidency, the Parliament, the Commission for steering the AI Act towards our shared European values. We need to have an eye to the global context when doing that, and at the same time stay true to those values. So with that, I'm hoping that we'll have a good discussion, and really excited for the dialogue ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Indeed, as you say, it has been a whirlwind, and I'm sure we will have plenty to discuss over the next hour or so. Just a reminder of a little bit of housekeeping. If you do want to ask questions, you can use the box on your screen if you're joining online. And once again, those in the room, we will have microphones if you want to raise your hand and ask a question of our panelists. You also have the option of using Slido. You can go to slido.com on your smartphones or on your browsers and use the hashtag AI governance. Or if you're here in the room, you can scan that big QR code and put your questions to our panelists using that. It's all very GDPR friendly. There's no need to download anything, and you can be anonymous if you want to be. With that, I was going to introduce our speakers. Unfortunately, I know we wanted to talk a lot about the Spanish presidency, but very last minute, Diego Rubio unfortunately cannot attend today and sends his regrets, but not to worry, because we do have some excellent panelists. We have joining us from the European Parliament, Iván García del Blanco, who is a rapporteur on the framework of the ethical aspects of AI, intelligence, robotics, and related technologies. We also have joining Raquel Jorge Ricart, who is the Technology Policy and International Affairs at Elcano Royal Institute. Raquel, I believe you are connected. Paula Gürtler is Research Assistant at Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy, or GRID Department at CEPS, the Centre for European Policy Studies. And last but not least, Marco Bianchini is Economist and Coordinator of the Digital for SMEs Global Initiative at OECD. So if I could have my panelists, thank you very much, join me on stage. We will have a big gift you. We will grab a seat and we will get you a handheld microphone. Of course, Iván, people need to be able to hear your thoughts and what's going on in the Parliament as well. But before we even start with you, we do have another rapporteur from the European Parliament, not able to be with us here in person, but Brando Benefe, who is co-rapporteur, as we all know, on the AI Act, has sent us this video message. Let's have a look.
Thank you for this invitation. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you in person, but I will try to give you a little contribution to this debate with this video. It's very important that we talk about AI in this moment because we are in the middle of negotiations with Council, Parliament, and Commission. It's a moment where we are paving the way for the AI legislation in Europe. But this is also something important looking at the global cooperation perspective. If we have an AI Act in Europe approved in a few weeks, this is our hope, it will be a building block of a global order around AI. Today we have a code of conduct on generative AI for the G7. We have a debate ongoing at UN level. We have OECD working on important issues like the definition of AI systems. And we have also an effort on the standardization that is starting with the involvement of the business sector. This needs to be put into some order. I didn't mention also the executive order of the US of President Biden. But this, again, needs to be put in a connection that is still not there. There is an ongoing exchange, but we need to align our work as much as possible. We will not have all the same approaches. We are sure about that. You have seen also the UK summit, where there were different approaches on the table, and also we can say maybe a difference in the tone of the whole meeting from the fundamental rights and the consumer protection and protection of small businesses to a larger safety perspective. I think these are two important elements to put on the table. We have, to some extent, some different paths on what we need to protect with legislation and also the voluntary codes, the voluntary recommendations on AI. On one end, we have domestic daily risks of AI. AI Act is a lot about that. What happens with the risky areas of use case of AI? So when we look at the use of health, the use in the context of health, of the administration of justice, the workplace, the schools. In these areas, we have defined the high-risk applications of AI. And we propose a conformity assessment, and also, probably, we are still negotiating, a fundamental rights impact assessment for the deployer, while the conformity assessment is for the provider of the system, that will protect from discrimination, algorithmic biases, security risks, health, the impact on personal life, on human rights, etc. This is something to address the issues that raise from the impact on our daily lives from the intake of AI. And also we are going in the AI Act to the point of prohibiting some uses. For example, some parts of the surveillance through biometric cameras. But there is also the other perspective, the systemic risk perspective, the global threats perspective, the weaponization of AI. We could discuss a lot about these larger scale issues that do not impact singularly on the individual. Yes, they do, but they have a massive perspective, a larger perspective that is not linked to the experience of a single person, but it's a series of issues that have some also, we can say, perspective on the future, because we are today discussing about the risks of AI getting out of control, AI being able to surpass human intelligence, becoming the general artificial intelligence, and this kind of debates that we had with CEOs, academics, and the global community. I think this is another story, and to tackle this aspect fully, we really need global cooperation. It's impossible that an AI Act, although we will deal with some issues around the most powerful models, we are still discussing about that, but we will discuss about systemic risks around the most powerful models. We are still trying to find a balance around the risk-based approach and this pre-market systemic risk preoccupation. But it will not be sufficient. To deal with these issues, we need a global cooperation. And so we need to continue working so that we have some minimum standards that are interoperable and that can build a safety net for AI on a global scale. This needs a corpus of not just institutional cooperation, but I want to say very clearly international law around artificial intelligence. And we need global bodies that are able to deal with that. I mean, next year in Italy with the G7, we will continue working on this AI issue. G20 is also taking its attention on that. We need that EU is ready to give its contribution with the AI Act being approved and also starting the implementation so that we can also learn what might not be okay and what should be adjusted, keeping flexibility and adaptability of this legislation. So we are in a crucial moment. It's important that we continue the debate. I hope these few reflections could help the discussion that you are having. Thank you very much, and let's keep in touch.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Brando, for the message. We know that his schedule is incredibly busy at the moment, as one can imagine. Iban, let's delve into what we're really talking about here. I remember I checked, it was 2016 when I first was in this room talking about, or the Microsoft Center, talking about robotics. And back then we had a rather unsophisticated view. Somebody always mentioned Asimov's first law of robotics in relation to AI and saying a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. We've got a lot more sophisticated since then in terms of what we're talking about with AI. But we're still talking about harms here, aren't we? We're still questioning the idea of risk. So give us your perspective on those European Parliament amendments, how they relate to risk and how they relate to harm.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. It's running. Thank you so much first for the invitation and to be for being part of this interesting panel and this interesting reflection. Of course, we are aware that AI can bring innumerable benefits, but at the same time inherent risks. And my colleague was mentioning some examples that we had to deal with. We can ignore these risks, and we are trying, to find a right balance between them in order not to hamper innovation, to hamper development in European Union, but at the same time making us responsible about trying to be in advance of this kind of possible mistakes, possible risks, and at the same time thinking about a possible compensation in order to acknowledge that could have these kind of problems in the future. We, of course, in the European Parliament, and my colleague mentioned that, we are, of course, are trying to defend what was our mandate. That was the final outcome of a global reflection for more than 4 or 5 years. We are almost reaching these 5 years of reflection inside, and taking into account or taking consideration that we know that member states are in some cases in a different mood, but we are trying to be a stick. What we consider are the main features of this regulation that might be, as was mentioned before too, might be this compass, or we pretend to create this kind of global compass for a global regulation on artificial intelligence. And in this regard, we tried to make an approach to this regulation of artificial intelligence by the criteria the likely risk from these kind of uses. That is the general criteria. These kind of uses that must be directly prohibited, and passing by these kind of uses that could be entailed by this title of high risk approaches, some medium categorized uses that could be object or subject of some impositions of special responsibilities in a matter, for example, of transparency, and the rest of the uses that beforehand are not controlled, but theoretically speaking, technically speaking, have to be at the same time under a global global ground of common principles that we are discussing now at the trilogues. At the trilogues, if they must be in the articles, or must be some kind of principles that are allowed outside, but in any case that are important for any kind of use of artificial intelligence inside the Union. This is the general approach about this topic. We are trying to finish our work. My colleague said that he's hopeful to reach a final agreement. That's true. We have to rely on our capacity, our will to find a final agreement. It is new that in some concrete nuances are quite difficult to reach a common position with Council, and we are speaking about things like the prohibitions, things about the extension even of the concept of high risk application, because more or less we agree about the sensitive fields that must be under this cover of high risk, but in which extent is a matter of discussion inside these trilogues. And of course, from this point on, we are discussing about in which way Europe could be, as I said at the beginning, this global compass, and in which way we could encourage these all superpowers of these all different regions of the world to reach a final agreement about basic concepts. That is important to take into account, that it might be difficult sometimes to put on common some principles that for us are quite evident and quite basic, but from a cultural perspective, and of course from a political point of view, from a systemic point of view, could be not that so for some parts of the world. But anyway, I think that there's a common and was enhancing this common knowledge about that we know at a global sphere some kind of shared principles, and I think that we have a real chance to put in common this risk that every one of us are in the mood to deal with, to tackle. No? As a matter of example, I took note at the very beginning of this draft that was released by China about this general purpose model, because in a theoretical point of view, in a general approach, might be so similar to the general approach that the European Parliament made about the regulation of these general purpose models, because they identified more or less the same risks that we identified afterwards. So there are common spheres, common fields in which we could be agreed with other parts of the world, taking note that, of course, there are quite huge differences, mainly about the uses. Think about, for instance, the question of massive surveillance, no, between China or a democracy like ours. But yeah, we are in this point, and of course, we are eager to find a final agreement that must be before the end of this year.
on this question of aligning internationally. We've got and the cultural sensibilities. We will have time to debate that a little bit further. Raquel, let me ask you to give us your opening thoughts. I mentioned about how we used to think very much in terms of harms, and some approaches that sound a little bit alarmist. I mean, isn't the AI governance that we need really just like any other bit of legislation? And what makes it different? What is the pressing need that we see?
Yes, well, Jennifer, thank you very much. And also, it makes me to thank the invitation. Well, I hear myself. If that is possible.
Raquel, I think we'll let you get that sorted out, and what I'll do is I'll turn to Paula here in the room for her opening thoughts, and we'll come back to you. So hold your powder. We'll join you in a moment. Paula, the same question to you. I mean, give me your opening perspective. Are we approaching AI in the right way? Are we striking the right balance between wanting to push innovation and all the great things AI can do for us, and the slightly more softly we need to worry about risks approach?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the question, Jennifer. Yeah, I think to me, in preparing for this panel, what I was thinking about mostly is about global AI governance and how crowded the space is. We already heard in the introduction, OECD has principles on AI, which they released already in 2019, so 4 years ago. This is not new anymore, but we're moving so quickly in this sphere that I think it is still very much something that we're trying to redefine over and over again. What are shared principles that we can come to terms with? Then, of course, we have the Global Partnership on AI, GPAI. We have the G7 Hiroshima process that was mentioned from this year. We have the joint G20 Osaka Leadership Declaration from 2019, UNESCO recommendations, and then the UN now has also the Global Advisory Body on AI. So just to set the scene once more, as one does in a panel, on how crowded it is, but it also illustrates a greater potential for international cooperation on AI. And I would say there are 3 main areas in which global cooperation can be particularly fruitful. The first one is sharing knowledge on how domestic AI regulation and governance is going. For example, what are loopholes in the regulation that we set up that can be exploited, or also figuring out what works, what doesn't work. Are we really affecting innovation once regulation is in place? The second area for international cooperation, I would say, is managing extraterritorial effects of AI regulation and technologies deployed domestically. And I see standards as one of the main areas for cooperation in this regard, in this area, because it helps us to find a common language, to find a different way of making compliance possible and less costly for business. And then the third one, and I think there we don't do nearly enough, and that is on ensuring that benefits are shared widely within societies and across societies, especially globally. We see a widening of inequalities, and I think algorithmic divide is also something to look out for. So I think in this area, we still see a lot of room for improvement. And I would say that the UN Advisory Body is a good step in the right direction because it is trying to be more inclusive. And it also has a mandate on focusing on global AI enablers. So not just on the risk, but also how can we make sure that everybody can benefit from this technology. Just to finish with maybe a cheesy image, but if we do want to have global AI governance, we need everyone around the table. And I think with AI in particular, that means that we need to help some countries build those chairs in the first place. But I understand that this is first, the priority needs to be wrapping up the AI Act, and then we can look further maybe. But those are my opening thoughts.
Absolutely. And you raised the issue of standards, and I think standardization may be one way in which you really can get everyone singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. Shall we turn to Marco, I think, to get your opening thoughts. Marco, can you hear us well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, give us your perspective. You've heard there from our 2 MEPs and also from Paula. What's your perspective on whether we are approaching the whole process of regulating AI correctly?
So indeed, this is something quite on our minds at the moment, which we are trying really to give a perspective and help as much as we can regulators around the world within the OECD and beyond the OECD to actually again reach an agreement and reach a common stamp in order to again to get to some let's say to some shared principles. Again, this is the spoke before me touched upon this. So to get on some shared principles and shared basic ideas that can be approved, then applied in regulation and implemented by different actors across the world. Of course, you know that the spaces in which we need most the international cooperation on regulation are the spaces in which there is more competition internationally. So by construction, we know that these are the hardest places which find cooperation, which find effective ways of aligning interests. Again, for the nature of the thing itself. But in particular, I would say that indeed, timing is of the essence when we talk about AI, because the OECD issued its principles in 2019. So 2019 means pre-COVID. Means I don't know pre-history right now. Think about it. Which means that I mean these points one point related to regulation in this area. I mean, it's common to track regulation, but in particular in this area that is so fast for policymakers keep the pace of innovation is particularly challenging. Because of course already our principles are for 2019. Then after that we started working on them, try to apply them to COVID. But now, if you want to check some of the work we did 2 years ago on the application of principles in 2021, it would be a lot about COVID and facing emergencies of that kind. So again, today it would be completely out of the news cycle, out of the things that people are really thinking about. So this means that also policymaking and regulatory bodies needs to keep at the pace. And in this sense, I think the European Union has, especially the Commission and all the discussion on the AI Act is really a case study that I think also in the future will be considered. So in the sense that I think indeed with the EU AI Act, you were saying that was proposed years ago, the Commission was moving quite fast, and they were quite ahead also of other parts of the world, of other actors around the world. And indeed, when the AI Act came to discussion already in 2022, it was, let's say, it was well set to set up again what we call the Brussels effect. So what we call the regulatory superpower. So to try to have an approach to AI that then would have been shared across in the whole world. And then ChatGPT happened. So let's say that by the end of 2022, there was this groundbreaking innovation that kind of capsized every discussion we have had up to the moment on artificial intelligence. Not completely, of course, but it really changed a bit the issue at hand, because we are still talking with the technology made the leap that, of course, was not yet in the regulation. So many things had to be rethought. And I think as well, some of the MEPs that spoke before me, they said, they've been, I think, working very hard in the last year on this, and I think also very good work, but indeed it shows how tough it is to keep pace. In this sense, for the again, from the perspective of the OECD, and again, I work specifically in the Center for Entrepreneurship and SMEs. So let's say from what my work, of course, my colleagues, we are the ones, again, my organization has produced the principles, and in the principles, we know that what we look at are a general principle that we think can be shared and have been approved as well by 46 countries. So basically between OECD countries and partner countries, including the G20, that are also beyond the OECD. So again, we're not talking only about Europe, we are talking about the US, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, so Mexico, Colombia. So again, a broader set of countries beyond the European Union. And again, some of these principles focus on inclusive growth, well-being, human-centered value and fairness, transparency and explainability, robustness, security and safety of AI systems, as well as accountability. These are the 5 principles that are at the core of the OECD principle. But of course, we're talking about principles, but where the discussion is now, and I think Mr. Garcia del Blanco was making this point very clearly. The point is now looking at the application, looking to which extent regulation should apply to different applications. That's where the devil is. These are the details in which the devils lie, and that's also what really can change and impact the industry heavily. Because nobody wants to overregulate. Everybody wants to, and especially I can say in the European Union, of course, nobody wants to miss the AI. As we know that already the US, again, having released some widely used global applications are already kind of ahead in this race. Nobody wants to miss the train, but at the same time, we want to guarantee the safety of our citizens. And again, from my perspective, working with small businesses and entrepreneurs, also our small businesses and entrepreneurs, and I will close on this on two sides. So thinking of the small businesses and entrepreneurs in the ICT sector, so the ones that actually will try to develop apps and software based on these large language models, on these what we call foundation models. And so again, that regulation will be very important to see where the burden of regulation will hit harder, basically. So who will be needing to comply to hard regulation? If the cost of that will be more on the ones that will be creating the foundation models, or on the small businesses that will create very often specific applications based on these large models. And on the other side, on all the other SMEs and entrepreneurs. So basically on the rest of the world. So any SMEs in any sector of every dimension that will very likely use this kind of technology. Because again, we think that really this time is different. And so in this sense, the OECD is trying with all its powers and with the convening power that we have to facilitate international discussion about this and to try to provide the policymakers with the most updated information that are.
Well, thank you, Marco. I mean, when you're talking about how it's going to work in practice, we're getting a little bit onto implementation stage. We won't jump ahead just yet to that, but we will certainly talk about a little bit in the rest of our discussion. Raquel, let me come back and see whether we have a good connection with you now. You've heard now from the other opening speakers, which I guess has given you a head start. So tell us a bit more about what you understand about how we're moving forward with the regulation.
Yes, again, thank you very much. I think people has text, so that's good news. Well, just to be brief, based on the comments from my co-panelists, the main idea here is that when it comes down to AI Act, we think about something that really touches on the digital single market. It has indeed a strong implications at the international level, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. The AI Act does not necessarily include explicitly implications in global governance of AI. What we can draw from some examples happening currently at present time is that in recent years we've seen sort of pattern, sort of trend, where a specific number of countries have to speed up specific processes and decisions on certain protocols and usages of AI. This would be called the multilateral coalition. And now, during these 2-3 last years, we see that some international organizations, such as the UN, they have decided to revamp their policies being
Raquel, I think, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop you there. I don't think we're actually being able to understand very clearly. We're missing every few words. Apologies for that. I'm once again going to have to move back to our guests in the room, and we will, I promise, try to get back to you at least to get a reaction from you and a synopsis from you on our discussion. Apologies for the technological hitches this evening. Let me come back to you, Imam. We've jumped around a little bit there. We heard about the OECD principles. We talked about perhaps the exporting, if you like, of regulations from the EU. Now, I know this is something following the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that the European Commission sees as an agenda, as it were, one to being able to set the standards. We will come back to standards and standardization as well, but to be the leading light. Now, there is a risk, as Marco was saying, that you go too fast, or to want to be the leader, you go too soon, and suddenly things have overtaken you by the time legislation is on the books. Is that something you're seeing happening with the current very fast push for the AI Act in Europe? And microphone.
No, I was to say that from my point of view, we were not that fast. That's true that we took the reflection on a general approach of a general regulation on artificial intelligence so soon, but it took us so many years, and we are discussing now, still discussing about the main figures and main topics, about main issues about this regulation. So we are taking time to reflect quite deeply in some aspects on that, and being aware that we are not going to be able to regulate every detail, every topic about artificial intelligence, and must be a lot of important regulations or agreements with the private sector that we'll take we have to take in the future. That's true. And additionally, we're quite aware too that we need to put on the table the possibility, the chance to put in common, as we were talking today, to put in common with other regions of the world some kind of general and world standards. That is the state of facts. Because we began in 2019, just after the OECD principles were published, to working on these general principles or ethical principles applicable to AI and robotics. I was the reporter on that. But afterwards, we had this special committee at the European Parliament reflecting about a general approach on artificial intelligence, and it lasted at least 1 year and a half. And then we had this proposal made by the Commission, and now, as I said, we are still discussing on the topic. So I don't think that we are taking that with that speed, a general regulation on that. And we are trying at the same time, to be proportionate with the goals that we are looking for. At the same time, as the representative of OECD said, trying not to hamper our own innovation, because we are quite aware too that we need to recover ground from a secondary position of the technological advance, but trying to balance the field in the same way, because some of the current most developed applications of artificial intelligence were developed without paying attention to things that for us Europeans are quite important. For instance, there's a relevant debate nowadays about the protection of IP rights, for instance. That is important for us, and we'd like to be in a general mark, in a worldwide mark, in the same mood that we Europeans consider the protection of IP rights.
A lot of rights competing for protection when we talk about this area. We'll come on to also data protection questions as well. But let me turn back to you, Paula. How possible is it? You listed a lot of different frameworks or approaches from a lot of different bodies. How feasible is it to get all these to work together? Is there room for collaboration, or will there be, to quote Tolkien, one ring to rule them all, and have as an AI Act as this international standard, like the European Commission would quite like it to be?
Thank you. I think there's a lot to unpack in that question already. Maybe coming also back to the export of the EU regulations, so Brussels effect, I guess, is the elephant in the room. Of course, it was also mentioned by the opening words just a minute ago. And I think I agree. We're not moving too quickly. We're not moving too fast with the AI Act. Rather, I think we're hitting a point where we might be moving too slowly, where we're trying to fit every latest development into the AI Act, which is challenging because the space will keep developing at the speed. So I think the focus needs to be on building some agile governance that can keep up with the speed of innovation to a certain extent. So much to say that I don't think the Brussels effect will necessarily happen on the AI Act, because we're not ahead anymore. And I think we've, for a bit now, probably. In terms of finding a global consensus, if we're speaking about ethical principles, that of course brings up a new other debate. I'm a philosopher by trade, so I won't go down that way. I'll spare us that. And I think to a certain extent, geopolitics will always define and how far global cooperation is actually possible. There are certainly actors that make it difficult to cooperate with, whereas others might be more like-minded, to use the words everybody knows.
Well, it's very diplomatic of you because no one wants to say it's social scoring and concerns about sort of monitoring of populations that we do see in different parts of the world that we, I think, absolutely don't want happening in the European Union. But there's ways of coping with that. Marco, let me come back to you. I mean, one of the things you listed as absolutely essential was transparency and labeling. Does that go far enough? We don't see packages of products saying may contain traces of AI. So where are we going with the labeling idea and the transparency idea? And doesn't that work for the good actors? But we also have to think about those maybe bad actors out there.
So indeed, this is something that goes very deeply in some of the potential risks that we see with artificial intelligence. And on this, for example, you can see that in the executive order of the US President that was published a couple of weeks ago, there was some direct reference to authentication and watermarking of specific, basically on any content that is produced by AI, by generative AI. So the point is that also there, you can think it I would say relatively easily, because still it's very, then the implementation, it could be extremely hard to do, but to say that, okay, on an article, you get watermark article you're reading online if it has been generated by a generative AI. But already if you think of a audio file, that starts to be very tricky, because there might be a disclaimer at the very beginning, but then malicious actors could cut the few seconds and then get the rest. So again, the technical issues there would be plenty. The point is, of course, you need some ways to, to understand how to protect IP rights. Again, Mr. Garcia del Blanco was referring to it, as well as Paula from Studio, as well on IP rights and ethics. But the point is how you, let's say, let a competitive AI ecosystem to develop. So leaving in a space for innovation while trying to keep together these kind of fundamental values that you want to be there. You want, in any case, to be implemented, and you want to, again, right there to protect your citizens. And I have to say that in international level, we have seen that there have been a lot of different approaches to this. And again, I'm referring to international experiences at the OECD. Is also to change a common misunderstanding. Sometimes we do not regulate the OECD. We support governments that then do regulate. So for us, it's a kind of an advisory position we're in. And we have seen that around the world, there have been people that are going from ethical frameworks to codes of conduct, guidelines, trying to introduce standards. I don't know, in Canada recently, they also introduced what we call the algorithmic impact assessment, as well as regulatory sandboxes, kind of things. So there are also different regulatory tools that can be used in order to try to keep up and try to catch up with the development of this large language model. And again, here we have to look again, large language model, referring mostly to generative AI. And maybe I will conclude, as I think before we were all referring to China. I think a very interesting development there is that now, as we know already, as we were talking about the Great Firewall at the time when talking about the internet, or the digital economy, already in China, we know that there is a very advanced censorship of what can and cannot go online. And for example, now we know that they have quite advanced research and quite a lot of publication as well that are starting to be shared at international level on building large language model as sensors of bigger foundation model. So basically, you have a foundation model and you build and train another one so that it can recognize if an existing foundation model is breaking the law or not. So again, there is innovation in all directions, and even using these same tools to regulate themselves and to check themselves.
Well, thank you, Marco. Raquel, we're going to persevere and try again. I'm told you have reconnected, so hopefully that will have done the trick. We have been talking quite a bit, so we've touched on things now. We've now started talking generative AI, large language models, biometrics. There's a lot to regulate, isn't there? Tell us about what you react to, what you've heard so far, and what you think the approach should be.
Yes, well, I hope that you can hear me well now.
Yes, much better.
Perfect, thanks. So I have been listening to all of my colleagues' points and your points, Jennifer, as well, for this discussion. Based on what Marco just said, in terms of And I think a very interesting point of vis-a-vis the AI Act is how large language models will be implemented and will be regulated. So, and that's the case, how and to what extent. Why? For example, when you look at the international scenario where we have witnessed several US-led sanctions vis-a-vis semiconductors and AI components to Chinese companies and as well to some Chinese providers, what we see is that in the case of large language models, there will be some impact on how China's companies working on large language models will develop these services. Because when you sanction semiconductors, you are as well sanctioning graphic processing units, which are essential for producing LLMs. So this means that depending on how the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and as well all the trilogues decide on LLMs, will have a strong impact not only on how the EU deploys its own voice, but also how each of the member states can frame and govern their own sanctions. Because it is true that sanctions are great in terms of criteria at the level, but afterwards the implementation and the interpretation depends on each member state. And we saw that, for example, in the case of the Netherlands a few months ago, when the Dutch government decided to join this export for semiconductors that, as I said, will impact on the LLM's development by some Chinese companies. So in terms of the international agenda of the AI Act, there are a large number of small details that can make a strong difference. And that is why when we look at some international negotiations, not even negotiations, maybe just discussions that are taking place at the global level, we have the case of the UN. The UN Secretary General just created the UN High-Level Advisory Board. The idea is to provide input by a number of experts to the upcoming 2024 Global Development Compact. This will not have any sort of legal binding impact on any country, but what it will have will be sort of impact on how you frame the discussion. In this case, I feel that the European Union institutions, stakeholders in general, not only governments, but also civil society actors, will have a voice in this. Because even if it will not, at least for me, it is unlikely that at least currently we could have a sort of international legally binding norm. Maybe on safety, maybe on security. We have seen that in the Safety AI Summit, even if most countries from the plural south were missing, except for Chile, Brazil, and other countries from the African continent. But still, there is a sort there is a way of framing your own narrative in these discussions. And I feel that these two issues, how specific EU member states can frame the top on AI at the global level and also UN, they play a major role.
Raquel, thank you. I think if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying we are really quite a long way from any sort of internationally, legally binding agreement, but that, of course, member states even themselves may have differences within the EU. So that is a problem if you're in the business of being an entrepreneur developing AI, regardless of what type of AI that might be. But I do want to talk a bit about this labeling. In particular, Ivan, the question has come in from one of our audience members already about the labeling of fake news. What are the provisions regarding disinformation, particularly during the upcoming election period for the European Parliament, but also elections in general? Microphone.
Yeah, sorry, I forget it every time. I have to use it. Yeah, that's a very important topic. We are discussing on that in this very moment about, again, in which extension, because I think that we have some kind of general agreement that we need some kind of identification about the unlawful uses and unethical uses of deep fakes. But the question again is in which way the provisions will be binding and at which extent. Of course, we agree about the use in arts or in a non-injuring way could be a subject of no control at all. But it's quite different to mark the difference, to mark exactly the limit to that. And I put a piece of example. We are discussing about the labeling, for instance, of texts. That is another important thing. That depending on this label or not, we could be dealing with a piece of newspapers that we could take for made by a human being, for instance, and that makes a difference depending on the moment, mainly for journalists and for the role of journalists inside this information field. That is important from a systemic point of view about the sustainability of a whole job and a whole way to make journalism, and that is again, additionally, a piece of a key piece of importance in the functioning of our democracies. I mean, journalism. But of course, talking about the use of deepfakes in video or even in voices, I think that is quite easy to make up ourselves in which way could be destroying for general confidence or general confidence, even in democratic contest. And in this regard, it's not just a matter of this negotiation of Artificial Intelligence Act, because there are more pieces of regulation that are taking into account that in order to regulate. Another piece important that is going to be negotiated at a trilogue this very month is about the Media Freedom Act. And in this Media Freedom Act, there are some other provisions about the use of deepfakes and the control of these deepfakes in the democratic context, and not only on that, but even in political advertisement. That is another piece important. We recently approved a piece of regulation on that about public. About politics advertisement, and we put up some kind of provisions on that too. So yeah, it's an important topic. We are from the European Parliament again have a very cautious approach. We try to be so intuitive in the way to control as much as we could this kind of unlawful uses, but the Council, I'm afraid, that are quite more open on that. And again, we are discussing on the exact point or the concrete point of balance on that.
Well, thank you. This is obviously something that has sparked interest. I see another comment or question coming in from Tony Gregory saying historic IP model of photographers owning the IP to their pictures had to change for the advent of moving pictures. Otherwise, the film and TV industry as we know it today would never have got started. Should we stick with the old notion of IP when we're looking to the future with generative AI? I suppose the point is that we come back to harms, because anyone who's been to the cinema recently will have seen some CGI, and no one's really concerned that that needs to be, stop the film, we need to be labeling this. It's when it comes down to the risk-based approach that it needs to matter. So thank you, Tony, for the comment, but we'll not get stuck into IP questions right now. I'm going to come back to Marco, actually, because we have another question as well, Marco. This one's for you. One of the debates in the AI Act trialogues is the regulation of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. What's your opinion on the proposal of self-regulation only? Isn't that transferring the responsibility to the deployer, who has no access to the settings of the original system? I think we're getting there at where does responsibility lie? And we'll come back then a little bit more on that as well. So Marco, your thoughts on that question?
Sure. Then, please let me first make a disclaimer saying that I'm not working directly in the Global Partnership of the AI. Not part of the team in the US, so I can just speak. I can just bring some of the reflection that I know from the colleagues I work closely with, but not working directly with this. And also a second disclaimer is that also it's not for the OECD to judge or to evaluate what they do. So we serve at the interest of the country. So basically, we will work as a secretariat, and let's say the global partnership on AI as well will move in the direction that the countries will decide to move it toward, because that's the nature of the exercise. So it's not for the OECD to take any decisions in this sense. One point that we can say is that, of course, within the global partnership on AI, and as well, you know that in OECD there are quite a lot of initiatives that have been launched at international level. We are working as a secretariat as well to support the Hiroshima process that started at G7 level, as well as we look at the Global Forum on Technology. There are various bodies across the OECD, and of course the OECD AI policy framework and the principles in which we are trying to look at AI under quite a lot of different aspects, and we are trying to touch on them all. So as you can imagine, it's quite a tall order. And the point there is that indeed the point on self-regulation, it's as everything, it goes back to the balance, in the sense that we remember when at the beginning, when there was the first, let's say, explosion of this generative AI phenomenon, when ChatGPT got to the public, and a few months later as well, we knew that in the US, the first reaction, basically in the White House, they gathered the tech leaders, and basically they asked them to self-regulate themselves, like they basically proposed them to abide by some guidelines. The point is that indeed it's a tough balancing act. And again, it's not for the OECD to decide. Of course, for the OECD, it's only to advise and try to support to the best of our capabilities. But the point there is to decide where the heavier where the regulations should hit harder. Because of course, when you're talking about self-regulation, it's something that it's more difficult to enforce. And so you can say in this way, you are leaving the ones that are producing foundation models much freer to do what they want to do. While at the same time, some people are saying, okay, it makes sense when you're developing something that is as broad as a foundation model. It's putting regulation more on the application developer kinda can have an effect also on the foundation models, because then the foundation models that are in which it's easier to demonstrate that you are complying to regulation are the ones that will be used the most to develop apps. So indeed, they will have a very strong competitive advantage then in the market. So indirectly, you are regulating them. Of course, again, it's a matter of priorities, and again, it's a matter for in democracies, it's a matter for elected officials to decide on. But this is something on which I think it will polarize the discussion. We're already seeing it, that trilogue in the EU is polarizing the discussion, but this is something happening also in Canada and the US, in different parts of the OECD and of the world. And maybe if I can finish on one point on this, is that also it's a process in which we are trying to be, we think at least that dialogue with stakeholders, with private sector, is particularly key. Like it's in many areas it is, but in this particular area, it's really fundamental. And on this, for example, I'm coordinating an initiative that is called Digital for SME, in which we talk about digitalization of small companies. And of course, we are partnering also with Microsoft, with other large tech providers, in order to try to have at the table all the actors that are involved. Of course, the government, but both large and small tech players and small businesses are the one that will be a receiver of the technology. Because again, in this area, I think that's really even more important than it usually is.
Thank you, Marco. Lucky for you to have so many caveats as an advisor, very diplomatic. Paula, let me turn back to you on this question of responsibility, and in particular, codes of conduct. I mean, what is your view on how those can be implemented, how they can actually work in practice, aligned with the various different frameworks? Where also is the role, as Marco mentioned, for private industry within that?
Yeah, I think I'm generally rather skeptical of code of conducts and self-regulation. I'm not sure in how far we can trust that when there is also a profit on the other end that you might be benefiting of, and how far we can trust that code of conducts are enforced, and especially if there is not a global body that can provide some oversight over that. I think that is a tricky a tricky approach, which might be controversial. I don't know, curious to hear more about it later. And I think private stakeholders definitely have a role to play, right? We need the expertise. They know what is happening. They know where innovation stands. But also within that, there's also a question of equality. Who has the resources among those private actors to actually engage in meaningful dialogue? Who has time and resources to spend to be part of international standardization efforts? So I think there's also a role to play for like SME associations to elevate those voices that are usually overlooked.
Well, absolutely. And of course, all SMEs are not created equal. They can be from the very traditional background with little technology to absolutely high-tech generative AI startups. Iban, a couple of questions for you that I think I'm going to link because they in some ways apply to exemptions. Jose is asking, with the many changes applied to the text, do you feel there is a risk to the automotive exemption in the final trialogue? Another question then is also regarding the implications of the use of AI in defense and cybersecurity and national opt-outs. What's your thought on exemptions for sectoral specific areas?
I don't see exactly this chance at the end. It's not exactly a thing about the areas. As was said from the very beginning, we are trying to approach or to make a general approach of a horizontal regulation from the perspective of possible dangers and possible harm. And in this regard, the exceptions might be in the way of things sometimes technical, or technical, or even or even juridical, no? Like which kind of matters are under the umbrella of the treaties. In this regard, for instance, one of the discussions is about a national or a member state competence that is national security, for instance. Beforehand, a general regulation or a reglement by the European Union is not be able to regulate on this point. And again, it's quite blurring sometimes the limit between national security and the prohibitions of non-desirable uses in things like the use of artificial intelligence in massive surveillance, for instance. It's quite difficult sometimes to put the right line, which exactly is the point, no? So I don't see that we are going to make some kind of differences between the players that are at the stake. For instance, we were highlighting the role of SMEs, and that's true that we have to be cautious about the impact on SMEs of an over-regulation. That I think it's more and more a responsibility by the public institutions to make sure that they are able to adapt themselves to this regulation by the public encouragement and the public support, than to make an exception on the compliance of this binding regulation, because we are dealing with fundamental rights, for instance. So it doesn't matter the player that could put at risk a fundamental right. The important thing is to avoid to a fundamental rights be broken. No, so I think that we are not dealing with that in that moment. And I don't remember exactly the second question. So.
Oh no, that was it. It was about exemptions for particularly national security. But then I was going to move on to build on questions of security and cybersecurity. You answered it. Yes, indeed. Have we questions in the room? Anybody want to raise a hand with a question to any of our panelists? And if so, I think I see one here tentatively. If we can get a microphone to the gentleman here. Anybody else, so that I know who I need to go to next? Okay.
Yes, my name's Oliver Gray. In fact, I was just typing a question in. So I was listening to what you were saying about on self-regulation, and surely with the delays that we've got in getting international agreements and things, we need people to do things now to put some principles in place. So one was, what are the things that we need to be encouraging people who are sitting there thinking about what should we do, because we're looking at this situation. And secondly, surely the solution is to have some key things about what self-regulation should be doing. to have some key pointers what those systems should have been, and please not like the GDPR, which did not encourage those types of systems.
Okay, well, we're not going to rehash the GDPR and its implementation at this point because we have only a few minutes left. Paula, would you like to talk? I know you said you're a bit skeptical of self-regulation, but are there any defining principles that you think could underpin our advice on that area for business?
I think I'm more curious to hear from the other panelists on this question.
Okay, no
I'll
problem.
be honest.
Ivan, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
No, I have to say that I'm skeptical to self-regulation, but I think that we can create the conditions in which we could encourage self-regulation in the way that could be more profitable than not having. No? And in this regard, for instance, we are going to establish, and I was mentioned that, we are going to establish some common principles, some general principles on every piece of artificial intelligence used in the European Union for all the uses. And I think that we'll have a big room to make an ethical use of artificial intelligence in whichever application that we could think about. Because if you take note of our general approach, if you take note about this kind of obligations of high-risk applications and of course prohibited uses of artificial intelligence in the European Union, at the end of the day, we'll realize that there are the few. There are few. There are so little. At the end, general use of artificial intelligence will be absolutely out of any kind of control. Will be the most common use of artificial intelligence inside the European Union. So when we are talking about regulation, there are some kind of, from my point of view, at least, some kind of exaggeration, because it will be not so. So I think that there's room enough to make some kind of self-regulation in any of the fields in order to make a more beneficial for common people the use of artificial intelligence. So we'll see if self-regulation will be enough or not in this regard. And again, I would like to touch upon a little debate on that was mentioned quite slightly in our interventions. That is about the common interest, the common share of the benefits of artificial intelligence. From this point of view, I think that we have another chance, and the sectors have that will develop these tools of artificial intelligence will have ways to make sure that benefits, and this is a kind of self-regulation from an ethical point of view, these benefits could be shared for the more people that we could achieve for them. No? So I think that we'll have room enough, but at the same time we have to take care of the real dangers, the real harms, and for that I'm quite as skeptical as my colleague did or said before.
If I may still jump on that, Chip, because you mentioned that we need to put principles in place, and principles are great because we can interpret them according to the context in which they apply, but that also means that there's a lot of room for interpretation, right? Mm-hmm. Just thinking about the concept of equality can mean so many different things, which is not necessarily the most relevant to AI, but fairness as well. There are many different ways in which we can understand it. So if we do want to have self-regulation, we need to have potentially certification schemes, and those have to be very specific so that we don't have too much room for interpretation of broad principles. Just to add on that. And then, yeah, there are high-risk use cases that should not fall under self-regulation.
Thank you very much. I know we've only just got a moment or two left to wrap up, and I'm going to come back to Raquel and Marco very briefly. I think we've covered the impacts on what were probably the three main spheres. We've talked a bit about the impact on society, the possibility of deep fakes, possibility of disinformation and impacts on elections. We've also looked at a little bit about the geopolitical landscape, the impact on how we in Europe interact with the rest of the world. I think the third area, which we haven't probably talked about quite as much, is the impact on industry and on competitiveness for companies in Europe and how that might play out. So I'm going to hand Raquel, in a very brief effort to just 1 or 2 minutes sum up. Do you think we're putting the emphasis on the right areas? And what are your sort of thoughts as we wrap up?
Yes, I would like just maybe to raise 2 points. So, the first point will be, well, 2 years ago, I worked as consultant for Joint Research Center at the European Commission on mapping how member states were delivering the national AI strategies based on the EU's coordinated plan on AI, which was released in 2018 and updated in 2021. And one of the main outputs from that mapping of capacities was basically that even if all member states agree on a number of high-impact sectors to which they should devote public and private funds to support the industries developing AI solutions for the environment, AI solutions for mobility, AI solutions for health, still we have a limited funding in the sector. And still some countries prefer certain top priority sectors instead of others. So this means that we can have a common, let's say, basic ground base on what we want as the European Union, but still it is still up to each member state to decide what are their priority sectors. And this has a direct impact on how the industry perceives the attractiveness to go to a certain European country to invest in AI, to set up a specific industry plants on the ground, and also hire people, which is another challenge for the international leadership, having a talent in Europe, create, attract, and retain talent. And the second point will be that, also based on some of the comments that you just made on national security and how this impacts and how this has an impact on the industry, I think it's very important to make a difference because sometimes we have the case of Europe that the European Union discusses about European security, but at the very end, national security depends on the national countries. So sometimes there are some blurring lines on the dual use of technologies and also of AI. Now the European Commission is deciding to into the wording of critical technologies instead of dual use technologies, and I think that is partially because AI is one of the top technologies in this area, and this will also help the European Commission and also member states to frame a common approach to AI, especially in the implications of security and also in the industry itself, as one needs legal certainty.
Raquel, thank you, and thank you for highlighting the, if you like, the high priority sectors, which I guess we could broadly term under the umbrella of AI for good. So things where it can deliver on sustainability goals, deliver on communication goals, deliver on things like using things like clean tech and so on. Marco, a final wrap-up thought from you, either drawing on competitiveness, on geopolitical, or, if you like, on the more societal aspects.
Competitiveness, again, being working, especially with entrepreneurs, means one point I would make is that indeed there are two things that we have to be very careful about for the development of competitive AI markets. And one is at, let's say, the high level. Of course, as we have seen already in the development of digital markets, is that there is a very strong possibility, a very strong risk of extreme oligopoly, so like concentration of power, concentration of market power. And we know that our competition authorities also do struggle quite a lot because it's the usual terms that have been used in by competition authorities in the past to regulate already in the digital economy have found themselves relatively hollow in some ways to try to avoid this process. And the second part is, again, talking about AI, but more specifically about generative AI, is that generative AI really lowered the barrier to entry, meaning that now any kind of business can really use it. My brother has a very small business. He has 3 people working for him, so like what we call a micro business. And he redid all his marketing material using ChatGPT during the last year because it's just, free and hyper easy to do. But at the same time, don't have to, of course, policymakers, and again, for us looking at it as research, we don't have to think that the fact that the barriers to entry are lower means that the digital divide is not there. And I would conclude with the 3 points that we know are key to access these technologies and to use them in a increase productivity and to use them in the right way, also for, again, smaller actors and smaller businesses. It's the one, it's access to, one is access to finance, one is access to talent, so to the people that can do it. And third one is access to data and computing power in this sector. And again, we think that for these three key aspects, there is something that regulators can do and policymakers can do in order to really make the development of this technology as democratic and competitive as possible.
Thank you very much, Marco and Raquel. And of course, thank you to our panelists in the room. There's been a lot to cover. We've been trying to focus on where the AI Act, without having seen the final text, will fit in relation to those other global movements and frameworks and codes of conduct. And I think possibly we can sum up and say, in some ways, AI is a tool like any other in that we need to have some sort of coherence. And in many ways, AI is a tool unlike any other in that we are taking into account so many other spheres of influence that it could impact on, rather than simply just straightforwardly looking at European competitiveness. So thank you so much for all your questions online. Apologies for some of those technical hitches, but we hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and you can continue the debate online using the hashtag EA Debates. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening.